Hello there, and welcome to Sleepy Nights. This is Kevin, and tonight we'll journey to a land of towering mountains and ancient legends. But first, try and make yourself comfortable wherever you might be. Just take a moment and find a position where you can fully rest. Maybe letting your head sink a little softer. Perhaps you have some blankets, and with them you're making a cocoon of warmth and safety around you, which would be the perfect setting for tonight's adventure. Now I'd like you to take a deep, slow breath in through your nose. When you breathe out, just feel the day's activities begin to fade away, like mist clearing from a mountain valley. And starting from your toes, imagine a wave of calm moving very slowly upward, starting at your little toes, through your feet, your ankles, your calves, thighs, your hips, all the way up your back. Each part becoming completely at rest. Let this peaceful feeling flow into your chest, your arms, your neck, and finally, your head. As usual, there's no need to concentrate too deeply to the story. Just let my voice carry you along as we drift into sleep. Now, as your breathing becomes steady and your mind quietens down, prepare to join me in a story of courage, wisdom, and unexpected friendship. The torches in the great hall of Castle Whitestone guttered in a sudden draught as the massive oak doors swung open. Sir Gareth strode forward, his armor gleaming in the firelight, the sound of his boots echoing across the stone floor. At the far end, King Edmund sat upon his throne, his face a mask of restrained grief. Your Majesty, Gareth said, dropping to one knee, his head bowed. I came as soon as I received your summons. The king studied the night before him. Sir Gareth of the Western Marches was not the most renowned of his knights, nor the most politically connected. But he was steadfast, honest, And most importantly, he knew the Black Fang Mountains better than any man alive. "Rise, Sir Gareth," the king commanded, his voice echoing in the vaulted chamber. "You know why I have summoned you." Gareth stood, meeting the king's gaze directly. "Your Majesty, I've only heard rumors." The king's hands tightened on the arms of his throne. "My son, Prince Rowan, has been missing for 3 moons now. The royal hunting party was attacked. Many good men died." His voice remained steady, but his eyes betrayed his pain. "My scouts have found evidence." He signaled, and a servant stepped forward, bearing a small wooden box. Inside lay a child's silver pendant, blackened as if by fire. Beside it rested something far more disturbing, an enormous scale that gleamed like burnished copper. "A lost dragon," Gareth breathed, recognizing the scale from the ancient texts he'd studied as a squire. "Yes," King Edmund confirmed, his voice hard with hatred. "We believed them extinct for a century, but this beast has returned, and it has taken my son." His voice broke before he mastered himself. "I've chosen you, Sir Gareth, because you know these mountains. Your father mapped their passes before you were born." Gareth's mind raced. Dragons were creatures of legend, monsters from his childhood tales. Yet, the evidence lay before him, undeniable. "I will find the prince, my king," he vowed, "and I will end this lost dragon." King Edmund's eyes flashed with grim satisfaction. "Bring me my son, and the dragon's head, Sir Gareth, and you shall have lands and titles beyond what any knight might dream." But as Gareth left the great hall, it was not dreams of reward that filled his thoughts, but the impossibility of his task. To slay a legend and rescue a prince. Stories were full of such quests, but few had happy endings. It was 5 days later. Sir Gareth stood at the base of a cliff face, high in the Black Fang Mountains. The journey had tested even his considerable skill. Narrow ledges, treacherous winds, unexpected snowfall despite the spring season. But the signs had grown clearer with each passing day. Enormous claw marks, scouring the stone, charred remains of mountain goats, and most telling of all, a half-melted knight's dagger bearing the royal crest. Now before him gaped a cave entrance, its mouth wide enough to admit 3 mounted knights riding abreast. Smoke-blackened rocks surrounded the opening, and the smell of sulphur hung in the air. Gareth drew his sword, its familiar weight comforting in his hand. The enchanted blade, blessed by the temple priests and forged with mountain iron, was said to be capable of piercing dragon scales. Whether the old tales were true, he would soon discover. With shield raised, he entered the darkness, a flickering torch held high in his left hand. The passage sloped downward immediately, the floor worn smooth as glass. Signs of the dragon's habitation were everywhere. Claw marks scoring the stone walls, the lingering smell of smoke, piles of bones from its meals. But as he descended deeper, Gareth noticed something odd. Scratches in the cave wall that formed pictures. A drawing of a dragon, what appeared to be a small figure with a crown. The passage opened suddenly into an enormous cavern, its ceiling lost in darkness high above. And there, coiled atop a mound of scattered items, some glittering like treasure, others oddly domestic, waited the last dragon of Alberon. The creature was magnificent even in the dim light. Copper scales gleaming like newly minted coins. Wings folded against its massive body. Ancient eyes regarding Gareth with unmistakable intelligence. It rose to its full height, unfurling wings that stretched from one side of the cavern to the other, and released a roar that shook loose stones from the ceiling. "Dragon," Gareth shouted, his voice nearly lost in the creature's thunderous challenge. "Return the king's son." The dragon answered with a blast of flame that Gareth barely deflected with his shield. And so the battle erupted with terrifying intensity. The dragon's fire forced Gareth to dive behind a rock formation. His sword strikes glanced off hardened scales. Both combatants circled, looking for an advantage in the uneven terrain of the cavern floor. Gareth's shoulder burned where claws had found a gap in his armor. The dragon favored one wing, where Gareth's blade had struck true. Neither could gain decisive advantage. Just as Gareth readied himself for a final, desperate charge, a small figure darted between them. "Stop. Please. Stop." A boy of perhaps 7 years, dressed in rough garments, stood with arms outstretched between the knight and the dragon. Despite his wild appearance, the golden circlet still visible beneath tangled hair confirmed what Gareth already knew. This was Prince Rowan. "Please don't hurt her," the prince cried. "Please. She saved me." Both knight and dragon froze, the boy's intervention creating an impossible moment of truce. "Your Highness," Gareth said, lowering his sword slightly, "I've come to return you to your father." "No." The boy backed toward the dragon, who lowered her massive head protectively. "My father doesn't understand. No one does." In the flickering torchlight, Gareth could see that the prince appeared unharmed. Indeed, he seemed healthy and unafraid, despite living in the presence of the kingdom's most feared creature. She could have killed me many times, Prince Rowan continued, his small hand resting on the dragon's scaled neck with casual familiarity. But she saved me instead. The bandits killed everyone else. I was lost in the forest for days. When I fell in the snow, I thought I would die. The dragon made a sound unlike anything Gareth had ever heard before. A low rumble that seemed almost gentle, protective. She brought me here, kept me warm, found food for me, the prince continued. You see, she's my friend, Sir Knight. She's the last of her kind, all alone in these mountains. Gareth lowered his sword completely, the impossible truth before him challenging everything he'd been told about dragons. Your father grieves for you, Your Highness. He believes you'd taken against your will. I wasn't at first, the boy admitted. But I choose to stay now. Father would only have her killed. The dragon watched Gareth with ancient, intelligent eyes. Eyes that seemed to understand exactly what hung in the balance. Your Highness, Gareth said finally. I cannot force you to return against your will. But neither can I leave you here forever. Your father is the king, and you are his only heir. What if... Prince Rowan began hesitantly. What if you told my father what you've seen? That she protected me? That, you know, she's the last of her kind? Gareth shook his head. No. Your father's hatred of dragons runs deep, Your Highness. The wars of your grandfather's time left scars that haven't yet healed. The boy's face fell, but then brightened with sudden inspiration. Then don't tell him you found me just yet. Return with some proof that I'm alive and well. Bring him this. he removed the royal signet ring he wore on a leather cord around his neck. Tell him you've tracked me to these mountains, but need more time. And that will give us more time. Time. Time for what, Your Highness? Time to prepare, the boy said, with unexpected wisdom. I need to show my father that she deserves to live. The dragons aren't the monsters he believes them to be. Gareth studied the earnest face of the prince. The protective stance of the dragon, and the evidence of their peaceful cohabitation around the cavern. Everything he had been taught told him to complete his mission. Slay the dragon, return the prince. But what he saw before him challenged those certainties. I'll return to your father with the ring, Gareth said at last. But, Your Highness, we will need more than time. We will need a plan. The great hall fell silent as Gareth approached the throne. His armor still bearing the marks of his mountain journey. King Edmund leaned forward, eyes flaring with desperate hope. Sir Gareth, you have news of my son. Gareth knelt, drawing forth the signet ring. Your Majesty, I bring proof the prince still lives. I've tracked him to the eastern face of the Black Fang Mountains. The king took the ring with trembling hands. And the dragon. I've seen signs of the creature, Gareth answered truthfully. But I require more time and supplies to complete my mission. The mountains are treacherous, and I believe caution will serve better than haste. King Edmund studied the knight's face. This is just a ring. You've seen my son, spoken with him. I've seen evidence he moves freely and he lives, Gareth replied, choosing his words very carefully. I believe with more time I can ensure his safe return. After a long moment, the king nodded. 2 weeks, Sir Gareth. Take what men and supplies you may need. Your Majesty, with respect, this mission requires stealth rather than force. I would go alone, as I have been. The king's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. 2 weeks, not a day more. And as Gareth left the great hall, he felt the weight of another pair of eyes upon him. Sir Darian, the king's champion, watched from the shadows, his expression unreadable. Gareth had never trusted the man. Too hungry for glory, too quick to volunteer for missions that would bring him recognition. For now, though, Gareth had more immediate concerns. Your father has given us 2 weeks, Gareth explained to Prince Rowan upon his return to the cave. 2 weeks, no more. The prince sat cross-legged beside the dragon he called Ember, sharing a meal of roasted mountain hare. The great beast had accepted Gareth's presence with wary tolerance, seeming to understand that the night now posed no immediate threat. Then we must be ready, Rowan said. I've thought about what to do. Father needs to meet Ember himself, to see that she's gentle and wise. Gareth shook his head. Your father would never come alone to such a meeting. He would bring knights, archers. It would be a trap, Your Highness. Then we must convince him before he comes, the prince insisted. Show him that the dragons were never the monsters our stories claim. And so, over the following days, an unlikely alliance formed between the knight, the prince, and the dragon. While Ember hunted in the high peaks, Gareth and Rowan explored deeper into the cave system. And what they discovered changed everything Gareth thought he knew about dragons. In a chamber far from the main cavern, ancient drawings covered the walls. Not childish scratches, but sophisticated images, showing dragons and humans working together, farming, building, even healing. Dragons breathing controlled flame to forge metal. Humans riding dragons through skies filled with stars. These must be thousands of years old, Gareth marveled, his torch illuminating page after page of history no human had seen for centuries. Even more remarkable were the scrolls they found, preserved in stone containers. Writings in an ancient human dialect that Gareth could partially decipher from his studies. They spoke of a time when dragons and humans lived in harmony, before wars and misunderstandings drove them apart. This changes everything, Gareth said. These scrolls, these drawings, they prove dragons weren't always our enemies. The prince nodded eagerly. Now, we just need to convince Father. Gareth began preparing the prince for the inevitable meeting with his father. They practiced what Rowan would say, how he would explain his time with Ember. The dragon, for her part, seemed to understand the gravity of their plan, allowing Rowan to demonstrate how she would behave in the king's presence. Meanwhile, Gareth created packages of evidence, carefully selected scrolls, drawings copied from the cave walls, even a small chest of dragon scales Ember had shed naturally. Each night, he would leave these where the king's scouts might find them, gradually preparing the ground for the truth. But fate rarely allows for perfect plans. On the 10th day, as Gareth returned from placing another evidence package, he spotted movement on the path below. Armor glinting in the afternoon sun. Sir Darian, leading a small party of knights, ascending the mountain. Gareth raced back to the cave, his heart pounding. We've been discovered, he told Rowan and Ember. The king's champion approaches with men. How? The prince asked, his face pale. We've been so careful. Darian must have grown suspicious. He's always resented me. Gareth checked his sword. He was jealous that I received this job. You should hide deeper in the cave while I intercept them. But the prince shook his head. No. If they found us, they'll keep coming. It's time for my plan. Ready or not. Your Highness, I am still your prince, Rowan said firmly. And I say we stand our ground. Ember will not harm them unless they attack first. I will speak to Sir Darian. Make him understand. Against better judgment, Gareth agreed. They positioned themselves at the cave entrance, the prince in front, Gareth at his side, Ember visible but not threatening within the shadow of the cave mouth. When Sir Darian's party rounded the final bend in the path and saw them, chaos erupted. Knights drew swords, archers knocked arrows, and Darian himself shouted in triumph. Stand aside, Sir Gareth. The prince is bewitched by the beast. I am not bewitched, Rowan called back. Ember saved me. She's been protecting me. Lies spread by the creature's magic, Darian spat. Your father sent me to finish what the traitor Sir Gareth would not. He raised his sword. Men, prepare to... You will listen to me. The prince's voice rang with authority that belied his years. I am Rowan, son of Edmund, heir to the throne of Alberon. And I command you to lower your weapons. Perhaps it was the shock of hearing such command from a child, or perhaps some vestige of loyalty to the royal bloodline. But the knights hesitated. Darian's sword remained high, but the others lowered their weapons slightly. The dragon could have killed me many times, Rowan continued, stepping forward. Instead, she saved me from death in the snow, fed me, protected me. Everything my father believes about dragons is wrong. They were once our allies, not our enemies. Darian sneered. Childish fantasy. Stand aside, Your Highness. Let us do our duty. Your duty is to me, Rowan replied. And I say you will not harm this dragon. And for a tense moment. No one moved. Then, Darian signaled his men. Take the prince, kill the beast, and the traitor. As the knights advanced, Ember moved with unexpected speed, placing herself between the threat and Prince Rowan. Gareth drew his sword, standing firm beside her. The prince refused to move, his small figure dwarfed by the confrontation around him. But before the first blow could fall, a horn blast echoed across the mountainside. All eyes turned to see a much larger force ascending the path, and at its head, the unmistakable figure of King Edmund himself. "Father," Rowan cried. Darian turned, surprised but quickly composing himself. "Your Majesty, we found the prince. The dragon has him in its thrall, and Sir Gareth has betrayed you." "Silence," the king commanded, his eyes fixed on his son, standing unharmed before a creature from a nightmare. "Silence all. Rowan, are you well?" "I am, Father," the prince called back. "Please, call off your men. Let me explain." The king raised his hand, halting his forces. He dismounted, approaching slowly, his hand on his sword. "Explain quickly, my son. That beast stands behind you, ready to strike." "She has never hurt me," Rowan said. "She saved me when I was lost in the mountains." "Everything you believe about dragons is wrong, Father." The boy gestured to Gareth. "Show him what we found." Gareth stepped forward cautiously, producing the ancient scrolls and drawings they had discovered. "Your Majesty, these were hidden deep in the cave. They show a different history than the one we've been taught. Dragons and humans once lived in peace." The king barely glanced at the evidence, his eyes never leaving the dragon. "A clever deception. Dragons are killers, boy. They destroyed entire villages in your grandfather's time. Because we hunted them first, Rowan cried. We drove them from their lands, killed their young. This is the last dragon, Father. The very last. And she chose mercy over vengeance when she found me. King Edmund's face hardened. Stand aside, Rowan. I'll not ask again. I will not, the prince replied, tears streaming down his face. If you want to kill her, you'll have to kill me first. The king blanched. Bewitchment, just as Darian said. Archers. A dozen bows raised in unison. Gareth moved to shield the prince, but Rowan stood firm, his arms outstretched before Ember. Father, please. What happened next would later be told and retold throughout the kingdom. As the king raised his hand to give the order to fire, a whistling sound cut through the air. From the ridge above, arrows flew, not from the king's men, but from hidden positions in the rocks. Bandits, dozens of them, had used the confrontation as cover to surround the royal party. The same bandits, Gareth realized with sudden clarity, who had attacked the royal hunting party months before. The first volley felled 3 of the king's knights. The second was aimed directly at King Edmund himself. Without hesitation, Ember the dragon launched from her position, her massive wings carrying her forward with incredible speed. She placed her body between the king and the incoming arrows, roaring in pain as they struck her scales. Father, Rowan cried, running to the king. For a frozen moment, King Edmund stared in disbelief at the dragon that had just saved his life. Then, battle erupted around them as bandits swarmed down from the ridges. Knights fought desperately against the unexpected attack. Darian proved his worth, his sword claiming 3 bandits in quick succession. Gareth found himself fighting back to back with men who had moments before been prepared to kill him. But it was Ember who turned the tide. The dragon rose into the air despite her wounds, raining fire upon the bandit positions, careful to avoid the king's men. Her massive tail swept attackers from the narrow path. Her claws tore through those who came too close. When the last bandit fell, an uneasy quiet descended upon the mountainside. Ember landed heavily near the cave entrance, blood flowing from a dozen arrow wounds. Rowan ran to her side, tears flowing freely now. "Help her," he begged his father. "Please." King Edmund stood motionless, his worldview visibly crumbling as he processed what he had witnessed. The dragon he had come to kill had saved his life, protected his son, fought alongside his knights. His eyes met Gareth's. "You knew." It wasn't a question. I discovered the truth, Your Majesty," Gareth replied. "As you have today." The king approached the wounded dragon slowly, his hand no longer on his sword. Ember watched him with pain-clouded eyes, but made no threatening move. "You saved my son," the king said quietly. "And now, you've saved me as well." He knelt beside the great creature, touching one of the wounds gently. "Master Darian, fetch the royal physician quickly." Darian stared in disbelief. "Your Majesty, you cannot mean to..." "I said quickly," the king roared, his authority brooking no argument. As the physician worked to remove arrows and treat Ember's wounds, the king sat with his son, listening at last to the full story of his rescue. Gareth showed him the ancient scrolls and drawings, explaining their significance. "All this time," King Edmund said finally, "our histories were wrong, or deliberately falsified." "Not entirely, Father," Rowan said. "There were wars between humans and dragons, terrible ones. But they weren't always our enemies." He looked at Ember with unbridled affection. "And they don't have to be in the future." The king was silent for a long moment, weighing centuries of belief against the evidence of his own eyes. "Well, would you have me do, my son? Let her live in peace, Rowan said immediately. Establish these mountains as a sanctuary, and let me visit her. He hesitated. I know I must return to the castle, to my duties. But Ember is my friend. I won't abandon her. King Edmund looked to Gareth. And you, Sir Light, what would you counsel? Gareth considered carefully. A new beginning, Your Majesty. A chance to right ancient wrongs. Perhaps one day, if there are more dragons, to rebuild what was lost between our kinds. Three days later, when Ember's wounds had begun to heal, a remarkable procession descended from the mountains. At its head rode King Edmund with Prince Rowan before him on his saddle. Behind them came Sir Gareth, carrying the ancient dragon scrolls. And most remarkably of all, walking with careful dignity despite her injuries, came Ember. The people of the nearest village fled indoors at the sight of a living dragon approaching with their king. But as days passed and Ember remained peaceful, curiosity overcame fear. Children were the first to approach, marveling at her scales and gentle demeanor. The adults followed more cautiously. True to his word, King Edmund established the Black Fang Mountains as a royal sanctuary. No dragon would be hunted there, no scales harvested, no eggs stolen. In time, watchtowers were built along the borders, manned by a new order of knights, dedicated to protecting the sanctuary and its sole inhabitant. Sir Gareth, having proven both his courage and wisdom, was appointed first knight of the Dragon Guard. His duty was not only to protect Ember, but to study the ancient scrolls and drawings, to recover the lost knowledge of human-dragon cooperation. Prince Rowan divided his time between royal duties at the castle and visits to his dragon friend. Under Gareth's guidance, he too studied the ancient knowledge, preparing for a day when he would rule, perhaps oversee a new era of peace between the species. And Ember, no longer the last dragon hiding in fear, took to the skies above her sanctuary, her copper scales gleaming in the sunlight. A living legend reborn from the shadows of myth. Many years later, when Prince Rowan had grown into a young man, and Sir Gareth's hair had begun to grey, Ember led them to a hidden chamber deep within her mountain home. There, nestled in a bed of heated stones, lay 3 large eggs, their shells gleaming with iridescent patterns. She wasn't the last after all, Gareth marveled, understanding at last why Ember had been so fiercely protective of her cave. Rowan placed a gentle hand on one egg, feeling the life stirring within. Not the last, he agreed. The first.